3 days after I buried my father. My husband walked through our front door and tossed his briefcase into the trash can. He was laughing on the phone, telling his mother that he had just quit his job because my father's $5 million estate was finally ours. He promised to buy her a luxury villa and pay off his sister's massive debts. I just sat there listening to him plan my financial ruin. Then my father's estate attorney called with news that changed everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who tried to take advantage of your grief. My name is Camille, and I am 33 years old. I work as a forensic accountant, following the money and spotting lies people bury in spreadsheets. I dismantle financial fraud daily, yet I missed the deception sitting across my own dining room table. For the past week, a suffocating fog of grief swallowed my world. My father, who built a successful real estate business from nothing, passed away suddenly from a heart attack. He was my rock, teaching me integrity and the necessity of protecting yourself. I spent the days following his death organizing his funeral, a draining service that took my last ounce of emotional strength. Gavin, my husband of 4 years, was surprisingly absent through it all. He claimed he was overwhelmed with project deadlines at his investment firm, leaving me to handle the floral arrangements and grieving relatives entirely on my own. I excused his absence because I loved him, believing he just did not know how to handle the emotional lifting that comes with death. I could not have been more wrong. It was late Friday afternoon, 3 days after we laid my father to rest. I sat on our living room floor, surrounded by manila folders and funeral invoices. My eyes were swollen, my head throbbing from a lack of sleep. I meticulously documented the expenses, finding strange comfort in the familiar rhythm of numbers. The house was quiet, giving me a moment to process the reality that my father was truly gone. That quiet was shattered when the front door swung open and slammed against the wall. Gavin strode into the hallway, his face flushed with triumphant energy. He was practically vibrating with excitement, pressing his phone to his ear and laughing loudly. He did not even look at me sitting on the floor surrounded by grief. Instead, he walked straight into the kitchen, unknotted his silk tie, and dropped his leather briefcase directly into the trash can. I watched in stunned silence as he pulled a beer from the refrigerator and continued his animated conversation. "Mom, I am telling you, it is done," Gavin said, his voice echoing. "I walked into HR today and quit, handed over my badge and walked right out. I am completely done with the corporate grind." I scrambled up invoices spilling off my lap. Gavin had worked there for 7 years, providing our primary health insurance. His next words hit me like a physical blow. "You do not have to worry about the mortgage anymore, Mom," Gavin continued, taking a drink of his beer. "Her dad left a $5 million estate. We are set for life. I am going to buy you that retirement villa in Palm Springs you have been looking at. You can pick out the exact model you want this weekend, and tell Melanie to stop crying about her credit card debt. I will transfer $500,000 to her account next week, so she can finally get those collection agencies off her back." I stood frozen. My father was barely in the ground, and my husband was already carving up his legacy to feed his mother and sister. Barbara had never liked me, thinking I was too independent for her son. Melanie was a chronic spender who jumped from one failed business venture to the next, expecting someone else to foot the bill. And now, Gavin was promising them my father's life work. Gavin ended the call with a cheerful promise to talk later and turned around, finally noticing me standing there. The triumphant smile on his face did not waver when he saw my tear-stained cheeks. "What did you just do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I quit my job, babe," he announced, closing the distance between us and trying to pull me into a hug. I stepped back, my body rigid with rising anger. "You quit your job 3 days after my father's funeral," I said, trying to make the words make sense. "And you are promising to buy your mother a house in Palm Springs and pay off Melanie's massive debts." Gavin rolled his eyes, annoyed by my lack of enthusiasm. "Oh, come on, Camille, do not be so dramatic. Your dad was a miserable old miser who sat on a mountain of cash while we slaved away paying a mortgage. He owed us this money for years. He never gave us a dime when he was alive, so it is only fair we enjoy it now." I stared at the man I had married, feeling like I was looking at a complete stranger. My father was a smart businessman who believed in earning your own way. He explicitly told Gavin he would not fund his risky day trading schemes or bail Melanie out of her constant financial disasters. My father saw right through Gavin's entitlement, and apparently he had been absolutely right. That money does not belong to your mother or your sister, I said, my voice hardening. It is my father's estate. It is my inheritance. Gavin's expression shifted, the charming smile melting away to reveal a cold, arrogant sneer. He took a step forward, invading my personal space. We are married, Camille. What is yours is mine. That is how the law works. That $5 million is marital property now, and as the head of this household, I decide how we allocate our assets. My family needs this money more than you need it sitting in some boring investment portfolio. I could not believe the absolute audacity of his words. He was trying to gaslight me into believing that securing his mother's luxury retirement was somehow my obligation. He was treating my tragedy as his personal lottery win. You do not get to make those decisions, I told him, keeping my tone perfectly level. You have no right to promise away money that you have not even seen yet. The reading of the will is not until Monday. You do not even know how the assets are structured. Gavin scoffed, taking another sip of his beer and leaning against the granite countertop. It is $5 million, Camille. I do not care how it is structured. It is going to hit our joint account, and I am going to take care of my family. Just sit back, relax, and let me handle the finances from here on out. I opened my mouth to tell him exactly how wrong he was, to explain that, as a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how protected inheritances usually were. But the shrill ring of my cell phone cut me off. I pulled the phone from my pocket and saw the name. It was Mr. Gallagher, my father's trusted estate attorney. A knot of dread formed in my stomach. Mr. Gallagher would not call me on a Friday evening unless it was an absolute emergency. I swiped to answer, turning my back on my husband's smug face. Camille, Mr. Gallagher said, his usually calm voice sounding incredibly tense. I am so sorry to disturb you, but we have a critical situation. I was just reviewing the banking alerts connected to your accounts. Someone just drained your entire joint emergency savings account. All $60,000 was withdrawn an hour ago to wire a non-refundable cash deposit to a real estate brokerage in Palm Springs. The reality of my husband's greed washed over me, setting the stage for a battle I would win. My fingers shook as I lowered the phone. The living room felt foreign, the air thick in my lungs. I did not want to believe what Mr. Gallagher had just told me. I opened my banking app, my heart pounding against my ribs. I typed my password, praying for a glitch. But numbers do not lie. The screen loaded, and there it was. Our joint emergency savings account, the safety net we spent the last 4 years building, showed a balance of exactly $0.00. $60,000 wiped out in a single wire transfer. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred into a gray smudge. That money was supposed to be our future. It was meant for emergencies, for a down payment for the children we talked about having. Now it was gone, traded for a non-refundable deposit on a luxury retirement villa for a woman who never treated me with respect. I turned to face the kitchen. Gavin was leaning against the granite counter, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He took another relaxed sip of his beer, completely oblivious to the hurricane of betrayal tearing through my chest. The contrast between my devastation and his casual arrogance was physically sickening. "How could you do this?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow, stripped of everything but raw shock. "Do what?" he replied, raising an eyebrow as if I were overreacting. I stepped into the kitchen and held up my phone so the glaring zero was facing him. "You drained our entire savings account, Gavin. Every single penny. You wired $60,000 to a broker in Palm Springs without speaking to me first." His smile finally faded, replaced by a sigh of profound annoyance. He set his beer down with a deliberate, heavy thud. "You were grieving, Camille. I did not want to bother you with administrative details. I made an executive decision for our family. It is a temporary bridge loan." "Administrative details," I repeated, the shock morphing into cold, sharp anger. "You stole our life savings to buy a house for your mother. That is not an administrative detail. That is financial ruin." Gavin crossed his arms over his chest, his posture instantly defensive. You are being completely irrational right now. It is just money. Dead money that was sitting in an account doing absolutely nothing. My mother has sacrificed her entire life for me and Melanie. She deserves to be comfortable in her retirement. Your father is gone, Camille. He does not need his millions anymore. We are getting that $5 million payout on Monday. The savings account will be replenished before you even realize it is gone. You are acting like I burned the house down. I took a deep breath, trying to force my forensic accountant brain to override my breaking heart. The math was clear, but the emotional cost was staggering. You do not understand how inheritances work, I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. Estates go through probate. Assets are tied up in trusts. You do not just get a massive check deposited into your checking account the day after the funeral. You have absolutely no idea what my father left or how he left it. Gavin scoffed, taking a step toward me. His towering frame suddenly felt intimidating rather than comforting. Stop lecturing me like I am one of your clients, he snapped. You have always done this. You always act like you are the smartest person in the room just because you stare at spreadsheets all day. We are married. The law says what is yours is mine. I spoke to a guy at work before I quit. Spouses get half of everything. So even if your father tried to keep it from me, the state will not let him. I just secured an incredible property for my mother before it went off the market. You should be thanking me for taking the initiative. Thanking you, I asked, stepping backward. You expect me to thank you for emptying our bank account 3 days after I watched my father get lowered into the ground. Gavin's face hardened, his eyes narrowing with a familiar cruel edge. Honestly, Camille, you are being incredibly selfish right now. You are hyper-fixating on a temporary dip in our savings while my family is finally getting a chance to breathe. You care more about protecting your dead father's money than you do about the living, breathing people right in front of you. My mother cried tears of joy today. My sister can finally stop dodging phone calls from debt collectors. But all you care about is your precious bank balance. You are proving exactly why your father was such a miserable, lonely old man. The mention of my father felt like a physical strike. He was generous to the people who actually worked hard and showed integrity, but he saw right through Gavin. My father had warned me before we got married. He had noticed how Gavin always seemed to forget his wallet at expensive dinners, how he constantly needed small loans to cover his credit card bills, how he always had a grand excuse for why his financial contributions fell short. I had defended Gavin back then. I had told my father that Gavin just needed time to find his footing in his career. I had blinded myself to the truth because I wanted to believe in the man I loved. Now the blindfold was ripped away. Gavin had never seen me as an equal partner. He saw me as an endless line of credit. I thought back to the last 4 years, the times I had worked 60-hour weeks to secure my promotions, while Gavin used his paid time off to take golf trips with his friends. The months I had paid the entire mortgage because he claimed his firm had shorted his bonus. He had always financially exploited my hard work, but I had made excuses for him. This was not compromise. This was a hostile takeover of my life. You had no right, I told him, keeping my tone deadly quiet. You had no right to touch that money. I am going to call the bank. I am going to report the transfer as fraudulent. Gavin laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the kitchen cabinets. Good luck with that. It is a joint account, Camille. My name is on it, just like yours. The bank will not do a single thing about it, and you know it. Stop throwing a tantrum and accept the new reality. We are rich now. We do not have to live like poor peasants, just because your father liked to hoard his wealth. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him his delusions of sudden wealth were about to crash down around him, but a loud, persistent ringing cut through the tense air of the living room. The doorbell echoed through the house, jarring and unexpected. I glanced at the microwave clock. It was past 8 in the evening. We were not expecting any visitors on a weeknight. I walked away from Gavin, leaving him standing in the cold kitchen, and moved toward the entryway. Through the narrow side window by the door, I saw the massive, familiar shape of a moving truck parked directly in our driveway. The engine was still idling, casting bright headlight beams across our front lawn. I pulled open the heavy wooden door. Standing on my porch was Melanie, Gavin's younger sister. She was wearing designer sunglasses despite the dark evening sky, holding a cardboard box under one arm. In her free hand, she was casually twirling a silver keyring around her index finger. I recognized the keychain immediately. It was the custom leather tag my father had given me, holding the key to his vacant lake house. A key that had been safely tucked inside my leather purse just hours ago. "Hey, sister-in-law," Melanie said, flashing a brilliant, unapologetic smile. "Gavin said it was cool if I moved into the lake house to escape my creditors. Do not worry, I will take great care of the place." I stared at the silver keyring spinning around my sister-in-law's finger. It was not just any key. It was the heavy brass key to my father's lake house, attached to the worn leather tag he had carried in his pocket for 20 years. The sheer audacity of Melanie standing on my porch, claiming my father's sanctuary as her own personal escape hatch, sent a surge of adrenaline straight to my core. I stepped squarely across the threshold, my body forming a physical barricade between her and the interior of my home. I lunged forward and snatched the leather keychain right out of her manicured hand. "Hey," Melanie yelped. She stumbled backward in surprise. "What is your problem, Camille? Gavin gave that to me." I gripped the brass key so tightly the jagged edges bit into my palm. "Gavin had absolutely no right to give you anything," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "That is my father's house. You are not stepping one single foot onto that property. You need to get back into that rented truck and turn it around right now." Melanie crossed her arms over her chest, slipping into her petulant teenager routine. "You cannot do this to me. The debt collectors have been calling my phone non-stop. My landlord officially handed me an eviction notice this morning. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. Gavin told me the lake house has been sitting completely empty for months. You are just being spiteful because you do not want to share." "I am being spiteful," I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Your financial disasters are not my responsibility to fix. My father worked his entire life to maintain that property. It is not a free hotel for you to trash while you hide from the consequences of your shopping addictions." "Give me the key back," Melanie whined, stomping her foot. "I am not leaving until I get what my brother promised me." Before I could tell her to get off my property, the sharp glare of headlights swept across the lawn. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled abruptly into the driveway, parking at a crooked angle right behind the moving truck. The driver's side door flew open, and my mother-in-law Barbara stepped out into the humid evening air. She looked every bit the wealthy matriarch she desperately pretended to be. I watched her march up the concrete walkway, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. "What on earth is going on out here?" Barbara demanded as she reached the bottom of the porch steps. She looked from Melanie's pouting face to my rigid posture, her eyes narrowing with instant disdain. "Mom, tell her to stop being so crazy," Melanie complained, pointing an accusing finger in my direction. "Gavin said I could have the lake house, but she physically attacked me and stole the key right out of my hand. I am just trying to move my boxes so I do not have to sleep in my car tonight." Barbara let out a loud, theatrical gasp. She placed a hand over her heart, looking at me as if I were a monster. "Camille, I cannot believe the way you are behaving. Hand that key back to your sister right this instant." I stood my ground, my back straight, refusing to yield an inch of space. "She is not my sister, Barbara, and she is not taking my father's house. Your son already drained my life savings to buy you a retirement villa in Palm Springs. Is that not enough financial blood for one evening?" Barbara's face turned a mottled shade of red. She took a step closer, intentionally raising her voice so the sound would carry across the street. "You greedy, cold-hearted widow," she spat out, making sure to enunciate every hateful syllable. Mrs. Gable, my elderly neighbor from across the street, stepped out onto her front porch, drawing her cardigan tight around her shoulders as she watched the spectacle unfold. I felt a hot flush of humiliation warm my cheeks, but I refused to break eye contact with my mother-in-law. "Your husband is simply trying to take care of his family," Barbara continued, her voice echoing loudly in the night air. "And you are throwing a childish fit over an empty house. Your father is dead, Camille. He does not need a lake house anymore. He cannot take it with him. You have millions of dollars coming your way on Monday, yet you are perfectly willing to let Melanie end up homeless just to satisfy your own selfish pride." The cruelty of her words took my breath away. She was weaponizing my father's death to justify their greed, twisting the narrative to make me the villain in my own tragedy. I opened my mouth to defend my father's memory, to tell her that his hard work was not a free buffet for her entitled children. But the heavy front door swung open behind me before I could speak. Gavin stepped out onto the porch, a fresh bottle of beer in his hand. He looked incredibly annoyed by the commotion disrupting his Friday evening. He assessed the scene, looking at his mother's angry face, his sister's fake tears, and my clenched fists. Instead of de-escalating the situation or defending his grieving wife, he chose his side without a second of hesitation. He walked right up to me, his broad shoulders blocking my view of the driveway. "Give her the key," Camille Gavin demanded, his tone dripping with arrogant authority. I shook my head, pressing my closed fist against my chest. "No, Gavin, you had no right to offer her my family home. You have crossed every conceivable line tonight. I am not giving her access to that house." Gavin's jaw tightened. He set his beer bottle down on the porch railing with a sharp clink. He did not ask again. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was not quite hard enough to leave a dark bruise, but it was incredibly firm, exerting a level of physical control and intimidation I had never experienced from him before. He twisted my arm slightly, applying just enough pressure to pry my fingers open one by one. I gasped, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. He snatched the brass key from my palm, leaving my hand empty and aching. He turned and dropped the key directly into Melanie's waiting hand. Then he turned back to me, puffing out his chest as he delivered his final verdict. "I am the man of this house," Gavin said, his voice loud enough for his mother and the neighbors to hear clearly. "We are legally married. That means your assets are my assets. I say Melanie gets the lake house, so she gets the lake house. You have absolutely no power to stop me." I expected to scream. I expected to cry or hit his chest or break down sobbing on the wooden planks of my front porch. But as I looked at the three of them standing there united in their sheer greed, something inside me completely shifted. The burning anger suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline realization. I was not looking at my family. I was looking at parasites. They did not love me. They never had. They only loved what they could extract from me. In that exact moment, the fog of my grief lifted, replaced by the sharp analytical precision of a forensic accountant. You do not argue with parasites, you exterminate them. I stopped fighting physically. I let my arms fall to my sides. I smoothed the wrinkles from my shirt, took a deliberate step back into the entryway of my house, and looked Gavin dead in the eyes. I let the silence stretch between us until his arrogant smile faltered just a fraction. "Fine," I said, my voice eerily calm and completely devoid of emotion. "Take the house, Melanie." Melanie cheered immediately, running toward her moving truck. Barbara shot me a triumphant, condescending smirk before turning on her heel and marching back to her luxury sedan. Gavin picked up his beer, looking incredibly satisfied with his display of dominance, and walked past me back into the kitchen without a single word of apology. I stood alone on the porch in the cool evening air, listening to the heavy rumble of the moving truck as Melanie backed out of the driveway. I watched Barbara's taillights disappear down the dark street. They thought they had won. They thought my silence was submission. They had absolutely no idea that I had just declared war. As the street grew quiet again, my cell phone vibrated violently against my hip. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. The screen illuminated the darkness, displaying a new notification. It was an encrypted email from Mr. Gallagher, my father's estate attorney. The subject line simply read, "Preliminary trust documents for your review." I leaned against the brick pillar of my porch out of Gavin's line of sight and opened the secure file. The PDF loaded, revealing 70 pages of dense legal text. I scrolled rapidly through the standard distribution terms until I reached page 42. My eyes locked onto a bold underlined section titled Financial Stability Clause. I read the paragraph carefully, the legal jargon translating into a beautiful, perfect weapon in my mind. My father had anticipated Gavin's greed. The terms were absolutely crystal clear. The estate was protected by an airtight, irrevocable trust. Any transfer of assets, properties, or equity would be immediately and indefinitely frozen if the beneficiary's spouse willfully terminated their employment without documented cause. Gavin's impulsive decision to quit his job earlier that afternoon had not secured his early retirement. It had triggered the ultimate failsafe. He knew nothing about this clause. He had no idea that his arrogant resignation had just locked the entire $5 million inheritance behind an impenetrable legal wall. I looked up from my phone, staring out into the quiet night, and a genuine smile finally touched my lips. The weekend passed in a surreal blur of absolute silence from my husband. Gavin did not return to our house. He ignored my calls and texts, presumably celebrating his newfound imaginary wealth with his mother and sister at the lake house. I spent those 2 days meticulously reviewing the 70 pages of trust documents, memorizing every legal boundary and loophole my father had constructed to protect me. By the time Monday morning arrived, I was no longer a grieving daughter scrambling for control. I was a professional accountant walking into a familiar battlefield, fully prepared to let them hang themselves. Mr. Gallagher's law office was located in a sleek glass building in the heart of downtown. The reception area smelled of expensive coffee and polished leather. I smoothed my black blazer, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy mahogany door leading to the main conference room. I was 5 minutes early, but Gavin, Barbara, and Melanie were already seated around the massive oval table. They looked like they had just won the lottery and were waiting to collect their check. Gavin was wearing a brand new custom suit that he certainly could not afford, leaning back in an ergonomic chair with his hands laced casually behind his head. He exuded an air of supreme arrogance. Barbara had her hair freshly styled, her designer handbag resting prominently on the polished wood surface. Melanie was busy taking selfies near the floor-to-ceiling windows, completely ignoring the solemnity of the occasion. "Ah, the widow finally graces us with her presence," Gavin said, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not bother to stand or offer a gesture of sympathy. "Have a seat, Camille. We have a lot of paperwork to get through so we can get this money moving." I pulled out a chair on the opposite side of the table, placing my leather portfolio precisely in front of me. "You are awfully cheerful for a man attending the reading of his father-in-law's will," I noted, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Barbara scoffed and waved her hand dismissively. "We are celebrating the legacy your father left behind, Camille. It is what he would have wanted. Speaking of which, I hope this lawyer of yours is efficient. I have a closing agent waiting for my call by noon today." Before I could respond, the side door opened, and Mr. Gallagher walked into the room. He was a distinguished man in his late 60s, with silver hair and an unreadable expression. He carried a thick stack of folders and took his seat at the head of the table. He offered me a warm, sympathetic smile before turning his professional gaze toward my in-laws. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Gallagher said, opening the top folder. "We are here to officially read the last will and testament and to discuss the distribution of the estate." "Let us skip the legal jargon and get right to the numbers," Gavin interrupted, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "My wife and I need to know the exact timeline for the asset transfer. My mother has a property waiting in Palm Springs, and I need to wire the remaining balance by Friday. We also need to authorize a transfer to clear my sister's debts. So how quickly can you cut the check?" Mr. Gallagher stopped sorting his papers. He looked at Gavin over the rim of his reading glasses, his expression hardening. "I beg your pardon," Mr. Gallagher asked, his voice deceptively quiet. "The money," Gavin repeated, speaking slowly as if addressing someone incompetent. "We need the $5 million transferred to our joint account today." Mr. Gallagher let out a heavy, tired sigh. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Gavin. "I am afraid you are laboring under a massive misconception about the nature of this estate and how wealth is actually managed. There is no check to cut today, tomorrow, or next week. There is no $5 million in cash sitting in a bank vault waiting to be wired to your personal checking account." The smug smiles vanished from the faces of my in-laws. Barbara sat up completely straight, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "What do you mean there is no cash?" she demanded. "My son told me the estate was worth $5 million. The total valuation of the estate is indeed approximately $5 million. Mr. Gallagher explained with practiced patience. However, that value is composed entirely of 100% equity in several commercial real estate properties. There are no liquid cash assets available for immediate distribution. Furthermore, the deceased did not leave these properties to be sold or liquidated at your discretion. Gavin stood up from his chair, his face flushing red. That is impossible. He was a rich old man. He had to have cash. You just need to liquidate one of the buildings. Sell it right now. We need that money. Sit down! Mr. Gallagher commanded, his voice suddenly sharp enough to echo off the glass walls. You do not issue orders in my conference room. You are not a beneficiary of this estate. Your wife is the sole named beneficiary, and the assets are currently held within a highly restricted, irrevocable trust. You have absolutely no legal authority to sell, leverage, or alter any property within this portfolio. Melanie stopped taking pictures and hurried over to the table looking panicked. But Gavin promised to pay my credit cards, she whined. How is he supposed to do that if there is no cash? Gavin waved her off, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Fine, he spat, dropping back into his chair. So the money is tied up in real estate. We will just take loans against the equity. Camille can sign the authorization papers today, and we will use the buildings as collateral to get the cash we need for my mother's house and Melanie's debts. Just show us where to sign. I sat silently watching the exact moment the trap my father built, prepared to spring shut. I did not say a word. I let Mr. Gallagher do his job. That brings us to the most critical provision of the trust, Mr. Gallagher said. He pulled a specific document from the stack and slid it to the center of the table. This estate is governed by a strict set of conditions designed to protect the beneficiary from financial exploitation. I will read clause section 4.2 directly into the record. Gavin rolled his eyes, clearly impatient. Just get on with it. Mr. Gallagher cleared his throat and began reading. In the event that the primary beneficiary is legally married at the time of my passing, the distribution of any trust assets, including dividends, equity loans, or property transfers, shall be contingent upon the continued financial stability of the marital household. Specifically, if the spouse of the beneficiary willfully terminates their primary employment without documented medical cause or prior mutual written agreement, all asset distributions from this trust shall be frozen indefinitely. The silence in the conference room was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that follows a lightning strike before the thunder hits. Gavin stared at the piece of paper in the center of the table, his mouth slightly open. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. Wait, Barbara said, her voice shaking as she looked from Mr. Gallagher to her son. What does that mean? What did he just say? I finally spoke, my voice steady and loud in the quiet room. It means the trust is locked, Barbara. It means my father knew exactly what kind of man your son is. Because Gavin walked into his office on Friday and impulsively quit his job simply because he thought he was going to live off my inheritance, he triggered the safety lock. He willfully terminated his employment without cause. Therefore, not a single penny of equity can be touched. Gavin erupted in a blind rage, but Barbara grabbed his arm. You signed a legally binding cash contract for that villa, she cried. If we default by this Friday, they will surely sue us. Barbara's grip tightened around Gavin's sleeve as the practical consequences finally caught up with the fantasy. She admitted that the $60,000 he had wired from our joint savings was not a harmless reservation fee. Gavin had signed a binding cash offer contract in her name with no financing contingency because he had been certain my father's estate would cover the rest. $400,000 was due by Friday. If the balance did not arrive, the seller could keep the entire deposit and pursue Barbara for breach of contract damages. Melanie stopped whining about her credit cards. Gavin's rage visibly buckled under the weight of the numbers. He looked from his mother to Mr. Gallagher, suddenly asking whether he could undo his resignation, borrow against one building, or sign some emergency waiver. Mr. Gallagher's expression did not move. The clause had already been triggered. The trust was frozen, and Gavin's promises had become liabilities the moment he made them. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I watched Gavin scramble to his feet, knocking his heavy leather chair backward against the conference room wall. He pleaded with Mr. Gallagher to find a loophole to rewrite the trust, or to let him withdraw his resignation letter. But Mr. Gallagher simply closed his leather folder, stood up, and told them the meeting was officially adjourned. Barbara was hyperventilating, clutching her chest and muttering about immediate lawsuits, while Melanie frantically called her friends to see if anyone had a spare couch. Gavin turned to me, his face twisted in a hideous mask of entitlement and fury, promising that this was far from over. When we finally returned to our house, he stormed through the rooms like a tornado, tearing through drawers, closets, and filing cabinets in a desperate search for anything of immediate value. He grabbed my mother's vintage pearl necklace from my jewelry box, demanded. I pawned my car and screamed that I was deliberately ruining his family because I was jealous of their closeness. I stood by the hallway wall, completely still, watching him unravel. When I calmly took the necklace back and threatened to call the police if he touched another item, he shoved past me, slammed the front door, and sped off into the afternoon heat. Less than 2 hours later, a sharp, authoritative knock rattled the front door. When I opened it, a man wearing a dark windbreaker and carrying a thick manila envelope asked for Camille. He handed me the envelope and walked away without another word. I looked down at the formal legal header. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage, accompanied by an emergency ex parte motion for temporary spousal support, filed by a prestigious downtown family law firm. Gavin was claiming severe financial abuse and emotional distress, arguing that I had coerced him into abandoning his career under false promises of wealth, only to deliberately withhold marital funds to render him destitute. In his filings, he demanded 50% of all trust assets, complete ownership of our marital home, and an immediate monthly maintenance stipend of $12,000 to maintain his accustomed standard of living. I did not shed a single tear when I read the divorce petition. The document felt less like the end of a marriage than a forensic exhibit, a clean-stamped record of how quickly Gavin could turn intimacy into leverage. He accused me of financial abuse, demanded half of the trust asked for the marital home, and requested $12,000 a month in temporary support. The language was dramatic, polished, and expensive. That last detail mattered more to me than the insults. I carried the papers into my home office, locked the door, and powered up the dual monitors I used for complex fraud cases. My grief was still there, heavy and raw, but my professional instincts had finally taken control. Gavin had spent years mocking my work as staring at spreadsheets. Now those same skills were the only thing standing between him and my father's legacy. The first question was simple. How had a man who claimed to be broke hired Hastings and Mercer within hours of leaving Mr. Gallagher's office? Their family law team was one of the most expensive in the city. I knew from prior litigation work that they required a substantial retainer before they would file an emergency motion. Gavin had just emptied our joint savings account. His ordinary checking balance had been almost nothing for months, yet a premium law firm had moved with remarkable speed on his behalf. I started with what I could lawfully preserve from our shared household systems. Router histories, synchronized browser metadata, cached login pages, and account identifiers Gavin had repeatedly used on devices connected to our home network. He had always been careless about digital hygiene. He reused old recovery addresses, allowed browsers to autofill usernames, and logged into financial portals from the same laptop he used to stream movies at our kitchen table. I did not need to guess his passwords. I needed the trail he had already left behind. Within an hour, I found a secondary email address I had not seen in years. It was an old college account tied to Gavin's name. That address appeared in the recovery information for a foreign corporate registry entry, Apex Crest Holdings, a limited liability company formed 6 months earlier through a proxy service in the Caribbean. The company had no public website, no employees, no operating address beyond the registered agent, and no obvious business purpose. On paper, it looked almost empty. Financially, it was anything but. I copied the registration data into a clean evidence log and began mapping the associated routing information. A series of international clearing records pointed to a private account linked to Apex Crest Holdings. The account was not connected to any household budget Gavin had ever disclosed to me. It was not on our tax worksheets. It was not listed in the financial affidavit attached to his divorce filing. He had hidden it completely. The transaction history made my stomach tighten. For 6 months, large transfers had been landing in the account at irregular intervals: $40,000, $62,000, $78,000, $55,000. The amounts were too large and too inconsistent to resemble an ordinary salary, and the transfer references did not match the bonus schedules I remembered from Gavin's job. I built a timeline and totaled the inflows. The figure came to just over $400,000. I forced myself not to jump to conclusions. In forensic work, suspicion is not proof. I checked whether the transfers could represent deferred compensation investment distributions, a legitimate private venture, or a loan. I searched public filings for contracts involving Apex Crest Holdings. Nothing. I compared the transfer dates with Gavin's pay stubs and annual compensation records that we had used for our mortgage applications. Nothing matched. Then I examined the originating institution on each wire. Every transfer traced back to custodial clearing accounts maintained by Gavin's former wealth management firm. That changed the entire character of the evidence. I zoomed in on the memo fields and internal routing codes. Several transfers carried abbreviated account references that looked like client portfolio identifiers rather than payroll designations. I cross-referenced those identifiers against fragments of account names preserved in cached pages from Gavin's work portal. The overlaps were too precise to dismiss. Money had moved out of accounts connected to the business Gavin managed and into a shell company he secretly controlled. I created an encrypted evidence folder and named it The Audit. Every screenshot received a timestamp. Every exported ledger was saved in its original format and duplicated onto a separate drive. I wrote a chain of custody note explaining where each artifact came from and what I had done to preserve it. If Gavin realized how much he had exposed through our shared network, he could try to delete local traces or claim I had altered them. I intended to make that argument impossible. As I worked, I found another anomaly. A domestic account had been opened in Gavin's name only days earlier. It showed a recent $30,000 deposit from a high-interest online lender. The supporting application preserved in a cached upload preview described Gavin as a guaranteed beneficiary of my father's estate and projected a large liquid distribution within the week. That statement was false. He was not a beneficiary at all. The loan explained how he could suddenly afford an aggressive divorce filing despite having just emptied our savings. I added the document to the evidence folder, but I kept my attention on the offshore account. The domestic loan was reckless. Apex Crest Holdings was deliberate. It had existed for half a year long before my father died. Gavin had built a hidden financial structure while sleeping beside me every night and telling me we were saving for a future together. The realization hurt more than I expected. I remembered every time I had covered a larger share of the mortgage because Gavin said a bonus had been delayed. I remembered him complaining that my father distrusted him for no reason. I remembered defending him. The old shame tried to rise, but I shut it down. Regret was not evidence. Evidence was evidence. I continued tracing the flow of funds until the pattern was unmistakable. The money did not originate from Gavin's payroll account. It did not come from a lawful commission pool. It did not come from investments registered to him. It moved out of custodial accounts controlled by his employer, passed through intermediary channels, and ended in a private offshore entity he had concealed from me from the court and apparently from everyone else. I still did not know what pressure had made him quit so abruptly on Friday. I did not know whether his employer had discovered the transfers or whether some other deadline was closing around him. Those questions mattered, but I refused to answer them with speculation. I would keep digging until the documents told me exactly why he ran. Before closing the file, I built a second timeline that separated what I knew from what I merely suspected. In one column, I listed verified facts the shell company existed 6 months before my father's death. The transfers originated inside Gavin's former firm. The amounts totaled more than $400,000, and the money landed in an account he controlled. In another column, I listed unanswered questions: who had authorized the transfers, whether the firm had discovered them, why Gavin quit on Friday, and why his panic had accelerated so suddenly after the funeral. That discipline mattered. If this ever reached a courtroom, I wanted every conclusion to rest on evidence, not anger. Gavin had spent days inventing stories. I would beat him by refusing to invent even one. I saved that distinction beside the ledger and locked the folder. For now, one fact was enough. I leaned back from the monitors and looked at the master ledger glowing on the screen. 6 months of irregular transfers. More than $400,000. A shell company Gavin controlled. Funds originating from accounts inside the firm he had just abandoned. Whatever explanation he planned to invent the numbers had already destroyed it. This was not a secret bonus. It was not a clever investment. It was not payroll. It was stolen money. The morning sun finally crested over the horizon, casting a harsh, bright light across my home office. I had been sitting in the exact same position for nearly 8 hours, my eyes burning from the intense glow of the monitors. I stretched my aching back and walked into the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of coffee. The absolute silence of the house was a stark contrast to the digital warfare I had just waged. As I stood by the counter waiting for the coffee to drip, my personal cell phone buzzed against the granite. I had changed all my primary contact information, but I kept my old device active on a restricted network specifically to monitor incoming communications. It was a text message from a mutual friend, someone I had known since my college days with Gavin. The message contained a single link to a popular social media platform and a brief concerned note asking if I was okay. I tapped the link, my forensic instincts fully engaged. The screen loaded a video that had already amassed thousands of views in the local community groups. Barbara was sitting on the beige sofa of my father's lake house, holding a crumpled tissue to her face. Melanie sat beside her, her arm wrapped protectively around her mother's shoulders. The camera angle was carefully staged to make the massive, luxurious living room look cold and unwelcoming. Barbara stared directly into the lens. Her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow, she told the camera that her son was trapped in an abusive marriage with a sociopath. She wept as she described how I had cruelly forced Gavin to quit his stressful corporate job, promising him a life of peace and financial security after my father's passing. She claimed that the moment he handed in his resignation, I had completely frozen their bank accounts, changed the locks on our house, and left her entire family to starve out of pure spite. Melanie chimed in, wiping away fake tears as she told the audience that I was trying to illegally evict them from the lake house, leaving them homeless and destitute. The sheer audacity of the video was almost impressive. They were spinning a narrative so completely detached from reality that it bordered on professional fiction. As I scrolled through the comments beneath the video, I watched the local community rally behind their manufactured grief. People I had known for years, neighbors who had waved to me from their driveways, and acquaintances from local businesses were leaving angry, hateful messages. They called me a greedy widow, a toxic wife, and a cold-hearted monster who was hoarding millions while punishing a loving family. The notifications on my old phone began to multiply rapidly. Direct messages poured in from mutual friends demanding an explanation. Some called me cruel, while others said they were deeply disappointed in my character. The smear campaign was moving at lightning speed, designed to isolate me socially and pressure me into surrendering the trust funds to make the public harassment stop. I decided to test the real-world waters. I needed a clear head, and sitting in the house was making me feel boxed in. I put on a simple pair of jeans and a sweater, grabbed my keys, and drove down to the local coffee shop I had frequented every Saturday morning for the past 3 years. As I pushed open the glass door, the familiar chime rang out, but the usual warm greetings were entirely absent. The barista, a college student, I always tipped, generously avoided my eyes and turned his back to wipe down an espresso machine. 2 women sitting at a corner table stopped their conversation the moment I walked in. I recognized them from a neighborhood block party we had attended last summer. They stared at me with open, undisguised contempt, leaning in to whisper to each other behind their coffee cups. The hostility in the small cafe was thick enough to cut with a knife. Gavin and his family had successfully painted me as the ultimate villain in our suburban community. They wanted me to feel ostracized. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of public shame, so I would break down and beg for a compromise. I ordered my black coffee, paid with cash, and walked out without lowering my head. I did not feel a single ounce of shame or panic. The glares of misinformed strangers meant absolutely nothing to me. Let them whisper. Let them send hateful messages. Let Barbara and Melanie perform their little tragedies for an audience of local gossips. In my profession, I learned a long time ago that public opinion does not hold up in a court of law. Spreadsheets do not care about social media comments. Bank routing numbers do not care about fake tears. I drove back to my house with a singular, unwavering focus. I ignored the buzzing of my old phone and locked myself back inside my office. The social sabotage was merely a distraction, a loud, flashy magic trick meant to draw my attention away from what Gavin was actually doing behind the scenes. He was terrified, and terrified men always make desperate, aggressive legal moves. I sat down at my desk and opened my secure email portal. There was an urgent message waiting for me from Mr. Gallagher marked with high importance. He had attached a formal legal document that had just been served to his office by Hastings and Mercer, the expensive family law firm representing Gavin. I opened the document, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with practiced speed. It was a new, highly aggressive motion filed directly with the family court, and it was far more dangerous than the initial divorce petition. Gavin was not just asking for spousal support anymore. He had found a legal loophole, and he was attempting to drive a bulldozer right through the protective walls of my father's trust. My heart rate elevated slightly as I read the specific claims outlined in the motion. It was a calculated, terrifying maneuver that proved Gavin's lawyer was worth every penny of the fraudulent retainer fee he had been paid. The motion detailed a specific financial transaction that had occurred late Friday afternoon, just hours before Gavin walked into our kitchen and announced his resignation. According to the document, Gavin had received a $5,000 performance bonus from his former employer earlier that week. He claimed that instead of depositing this money into his personal checking account, he had transferred the entire $5,000 directly into the primary holding account of my father's trust. He argued that this transfer was made with the mutual understanding that we were merging our finances for our future. The legal implication of this claim was absolutely devastating. In our state, inheritances are generally protected as separate property immune from division during a divorce. However, if a spouse can prove that they contributed their own personal income into the inheritance accounts, the legal boundary is broken. The assets are no longer considered entirely separate. They become what the court calls commingled marital assets. I stared at the screen, the severity of the situation settling heavily over my shoulders. Gavin argued that because his $5,000 bonus was mixed into the holding account, the shield of the entire $5 million estate had been pierced. He was demanding that the family court judge invalidate the trust entirely. By exploiting this commingled asset loophole, Gavin was legally requesting that the judge order the immediate liquidation of all the commercial real estate properties my father had spent his life building. He wanted the buildings sold, the cash pooled, and the entire $5 million estate split 50-50 between us as standard marital property. It was a brilliant, malicious legal strike designed to bypass the financial stability clause completely and force a massive cash payout. If he succeeded, he would walk away with enough clean money to pay back his stolen corporate funds without anyone ever discovering his dark crimes. The terrifying reality was that by state law, this cunning loophole could potentially force a judge to liquidate the real estate and split it 50-50. I sat perfectly still, letting the sheer weight of that possibility settle over me. Gavin and his expensive lawyers thought they had found the ultimate pressure point. They believed that the threat of losing my father's commercial empire would force me to the negotiating table where I would hand over millions just to make the lawsuit go away. I closed the legal document on my monitor and took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I needed to formulate a counter-strategy, a way to definitively prove that his $5,000 deposit had never actually mixed with the core trust assets. But before I could even open a new spreadsheet to map out my defense, a loud, obnoxious notification tone erupted from the old cell phone resting on the edge of my desk. I glanced over, expecting another hateful message from a misinformed neighbor. Instead, my screen was lit up with an automated alert from a local community watch application. My father's lake house address was tagged in a noise complaint. Right below the community alert was a direct message from the same college friend who had sent me Barbara's tearful video earlier. The message simply said that I needed to see what Melanie was broadcasting live right now. I tapped the link, my chest tightening with a sudden sense of dread. The screen transitioned to a live video feed, and the loud, pulsing beat of heavy bass music immediately blasted through my phone speakers. The camera was shaking slightly, held by someone navigating through a crowded room. As the lens focused, I recognized the interior of my father's lake house. It was completely overrun. Dozens of people I had never seen before were packed into the living room, holding red plastic cups and shouting over the deafening music. Empty beer bottles and crumpled food wrappers littered the pristine hardwood floors my father had meticulously restored just last summer. The camera panned around the room before finally settling on Melanie. She was wearing a sequined party dress, holding a bottle of champagne in one hand and her phone in the other, broadcasting her manufactured glamorous lifestyle to her followers. She looked incredibly intoxicated, her makeup slightly smeared as she slurred her words, welcoming her viewers to her brand-new luxury waterfront estate. I watched in absolute horror as she climbed onto the armrest of my father's antique leather reading chair, using her heavy high heels to balance on the delicate hand-carved mahogany frame. That chair was my father's favorite place in the entire world. He used to sit there every Sunday morning reading the newspaper and watching the sun rise over the water. It was a priceless family heirloom that he had inherited from his own grandfather. As I stared at the screen, Melanie lost her balance slightly. She slipped and the sharp heel of her shoe dragged forcefully down the side of the chair, leaving a deep, jagged gouge in the polished wood. She did not even flinch. Instead, she laughed loudly, tipped the champagne bottle back, and spilled a generous amount of sticky alcohol directly onto the vintage leather seat. The sheer disrespect, the careless destruction of my father's sanctuary shattered my cool, analytical composure. This was not a legal maneuver or a financial manipulation. This was a direct physical violation of my family's legacy. I slammed my laptop shut, grabbed my car keys from the desk, and sprinted out the front door. The analytical forensic accountant was temporarily pushed aside by a fiercely protective daughter who had seen enough. The drive to the lake house took less than 20 minutes, but my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I sped down the dark, winding rural roads, I connected my phone to my car's Bluetooth system and dialed the local police dispatch. I identified myself as the legal owner of the property and reported an ongoing trespassing situation involving dozens of unauthorized individuals destroying a vacant residence. The dispatcher promised to send 2 patrol cars immediately, given the size of the unauthorized gathering. I pulled into the long gravel driveway, just as the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the trees behind me. The noise coming from the house was deafening even from outside. The front door was propped wide open, and several young adults were loitering on the porch, dropping cigarette butts into my father's carefully tended flower beds. I stepped out of my car, the cool night air hitting my face as 2 police officers approached me. I quickly introduced myself, presenting my driver's license and explaining that my husband's sister had unlawfully entered the property after stealing the key. The officers nodded, asking me to wait near my vehicle while they secured the premises. I watched as they walked up the porch steps, their presence immediately causing the teenagers outside to scatter into the yard. The officers entered the house, and within moments, the heavy bass music was abruptly cut off. A chorus of groans and complaints spilled out through the open door as the police ordered the unauthorized guests to clear the property immediately. Groups of people began pouring out of the house, hurrying to their cars and speeding off into the night to avoid any legal trouble. I waited by my car, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, watching the house empty out. Finally, Melanie appeared in the doorway, flanked by the 2 police officers. She did not look frightened or apologetic. She looked incredibly annoyed. She marched down the porch steps and stomped across the gravel driveway toward me, her arms crossing over her chest in a mirror image of my own defensive posture. The 2 police officers followed closely behind her, looking frustrated by the situation. I stepped forward, ready to demand she hand over the key and leave my property. Before I could speak, Melanie shot me a venomous glare. "You are completely psychotic, Camille," she yelled, her voice echoing in the quiet aftermath of the party. "You cannot just call the cops and try to throw me out onto the street. I live here. This is my house now." I turned my attention away from her and looked directly at the lead police officer. "Officer, this woman is my sister-in-law. She stole the key to this property from my purse on Friday evening. My father recently passed away, and this house belongs to his estate, of which I am the sole legal executor. She has absolutely no right to be here, and I want her removed for trespassing and vandalism immediately." The officer let out a long, heavy breath and hooked his thumbs into his duty belt. "Ma, I understand you are upset about the party, and we have cleared out the unregistered guests. However, we cannot force this young woman to vacate the premises tonight." I stared at him, completely baffled. "Why on earth not?" I demanded. "She is trespassing. She broke into my father's vacant home." The officer shook his head with a firm expression. "Because she provided documentation proving she has a legal right to reside here tonight," he explained. He held up a folded piece of white paper. When questioned, she produced a formal lease agreement. "According to this paperwork, she is a legitimate tenant. Therefore, this is not a criminal trespassing situation at all. It is strictly a civil matter now. If you want her removed, you must go to the courthouse on Monday morning, file a formal eviction notice, and complete the standard 90-day legal eviction process." Melanie burst into loud, obnoxious laughter. She stepped forward and snatched the paper back from the officer, waving it triumphantly. "Did you really think my brother would let me move in here without proper paperwork?" she gloated. "He made sure everything was legal before I unpacked a single box. You cannot touch me, Camille." I looked down at the document she was waving so proudly. The lease bore the unmistakable signature of my deceased father. Melanie grinned, confident she had won, but pulled the paper a fraction too close to my face. I immediately spotted the fatal error in the document's date. The date stamped beneath my father's forged signature was October the 12th. My father had passed on October the 10th. I stared at the crisp black ink, calculating the sheer stupidity of their crime. Gavin fabricated a residential lease agreement and backdated it, but in his arrogant rush, he had completely forgotten the actual timeline of my father's death. It was a glaring mistake that instantly elevated this situation from a civil dispute to felony forgery. The sheer arrogance of his plan was astounding. He thought I was too blinded by grief to verify the basic details. I looked up and met the weary gaze of the police officer. I could have demanded they arrest her on the spot for presenting fraudulent documents. But as I watched Melanie standing on the porch, my strategic instincts took over. If I called out the forgery, now she would just play dumb. She would throw all the blame onto an anonymous third party. Gavin would have time to cover his digital tracks and delete the original files. I needed incontrovertible proof of exactly who created that document, when it was drafted, and on which device. I handed the piece of paper back to the police officer and took a deliberate step backward. "I understand, officer," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and devoid of the righteous anger churning in my chest. "If she has a lease, I will handle this through the proper channels at the courthouse on Monday morning. I apologize for taking up your time here tonight." Melanie let out a loud, victorious cackle. She snatched the paper from the officer and waved it in the air. "That is exactly right, Camille," she gloated. "You better run along now before I decide to file a harassment complaint against you. This is my house now. You do not get to dictate how I live my life anymore." I did not offer her a single word in response. I simply turned around, walked back to my car, and drove away from the property. I left her standing on the porch, completely convinced that she had outsmarted me. What she just did not realize was that I had just given them enough rope to hang themselves. The drive back to my house was a blur of calculated planning. My mind was mapping out the specific data scraping protocols I would need to deploy. I headed straight for my home office, locked the door, and powered up my workstation. The monitors flared to life, casting a pale, cool light across the dark room. Melanie was incredibly vain and fundamentally careless. She lived for public validation, updating her social media to prove her manufactured status to her followers. I knew she would not be able to resist bragging about her legal victory. I just logged into an anonymous account and pulled up her public profile on a video sharing platform. Less than 20 minutes after the police left the lake house, Melanie had gone live. The video showed her holding the lease agreement to the camera to prove she defeated her sister-in-law. She held the document dangerously close to her phone lens, bragging about her brother's brilliant legal maneuvering. Below the video, she pinned a link to a cloud storage folder, inviting them to look at the paperwork themselves. It was an act of staggering digital negligence. I clicked the link and downloaded the high-resolution image file directly to my encrypted hard drive. Every digital document carries a hidden layer of information called metadata. This data records the history of the file, including the software used to create it, the author profile, the device identifier, and the precise timestamps. I opened my extraction software and ran the file through the parser. Code cascaded down my screen in bright green text, stripping away the visual layer of the document to reveal the digital skeleton underneath. The results were absolute perfection. The metadata proved that the original text document had not been drafted by a real estate broker. The author profile was registered to Gavin's laptop. The most damning piece of evidence was the creation timestamp. The document had been generated, typed, and saved at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon on October the 12th. 2 entire days after my father suffered his fatal heart attack. Gavin had sat in our living room, presumably while I was at the funeral home, making arrangements for my father's burial, and typed up a fraudulent lease. He digitally forged my father's signature, saved the file, and printed it out to give to his sister, completely convinced he had outsmarted everyone in the room. It was a textbook case of felony forgery that carried severe criminal penalties in our state. I exported the report. I leaned back, staring at the irrefutable evidence glowing on my monitor. I had enough proof to call the police right now and have both Gavin and Melanie arrested for fraud. But I forced myself to pause. If I dropped the hammer now, Gavin would still have his aggressive divorce lawyers pushing the commingled asset narrative. He would still try to force the liquidation of my father's commercial real estate. I needed to catch them in a much larger net. Focused entirely on the cache of local network data I scraped from Gavin's laptop earlier. I had already uncovered the offshore accounts and the personal loan fraud, but the timeline still bothered me. Why did he quit his job so abruptly on Friday afternoon? Why did he need to forge a lease for Melanie instead of paying her rent? The panic driving his decisions suggested a ticking clock I had not yet identified. How was not a man acting out of greed alone, he was a man acting out of sheer, unadulterated terror. Something massive was chasing him, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. I initiated a scan of the background network requests his browser made over the past 48 hours. I filtered the results targeting the internal server domain of his former employer. Gavin had been accessing his firm's employee portal repeatedly on Thursday and Friday morning, compulsively refreshing the pages. I pulled the cached data from those sessions, reconstructing the web pages he viewed just hours before he tossed his briefcase into the trash can. The screen flickered as the reconstructed email inbox loaded. My eyes darted across the subject lines, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Most were standard client updates and meeting requests. But there was one email flagged with high importance and marked with a bright red urgent icon sitting right at the top of his inbox. It was sent at 9 in the morning on Friday directly from the head of the corporate compliance department. I clicked the link and read the body of the email. My breath hitched in my throat as the words burned themselves into my memory. The compliance director was notifying Gavin that an automated internal security sweep had flagged multiple unauthorized wire transfers originating from his senior client portfolios. The message stated that a mandatory in-person disciplinary hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. The email explicitly warned him that local law enforcement and federal financial investigators had already been contacted regarding a missing balance of exactly $400,000. Gavin had not quit his job to live a life of leisure on my inheritance. He fled the corporate building on Friday afternoon because he was 48 hours away from being escorted out in handcuffs. He was going to be arrested for embezzlement. He desperately needed my father's $5 million estate to secretly replace the stolen corporate funds before the investigators finalized their case on Monday morning. His aggressive divorce filings, the forged lease, and the frantic attempts to commingle the trust assets were not just greed. They were the desperate moves of a cornered criminal trying to avoid federal prison. The entire nightmare he unleashed on my life was just a cover-up. The magnitude of his desperation washed over me in a chilling wave of understanding. He had not filed for divorce because he was genuinely angry about my father's trust. He had filed for divorce claiming financial abuse and demanding emergency spousal support because he needed a family court judge to force me to liquidate my assets. He needed clean, untraceable cash, and he needed it immediately to replace the funds he had siphoned from his firm before the compliance auditors finalized their semi-annual review. My father's $5 million estate was not just supposed to be Gavin's early retirement fund, it was supposed to be his get-out-of-jail-free card. I sat perfectly still, letting the sheer weight of that reality settle over me. Gavin had not just skipped work to celebrate his imaginary wealth on Friday. While he sat in Mr. Gallagher's office demanding a $5 million check, his former employers were sitting with federal investigators staring at a missing balance of $400,000. Gavin was already a ghost to his company. I had bet his entire life, his freedom and his future on the absolute certainty that he could bully me into opening my father's trust on Monday. But my father's financial stability clause had slammed a steel door right in his face. I remained in my home office watching the morning sun stretch across the hardwood floor. The deadline for Barbara's luxury retirement villa in Palm Springs was looming like a dark cloud over his head. He needed cold, untraceable cash to pay his aggressive divorce lawyer to push the commingled asset motion through the family court. I was hoping a judge would order a temporary liquidation of my father's commercial properties, giving him the massive cash payout he needed to save himself from federal prison. I needed to secure the evidence right there. Digital files were incredibly safe on my encrypted hard drive, but in high-stakes litigation, I always preferred to maintain a chain of physical custody. I carefully exported the forensic audit, burned the data onto 3 separate flash drives, and placed them into my briefcase. I needed to print hard copies of the entire dossier and lock them inside a physical vault at my corporate office downtown. I grabbed my car keys, locked the front door of my house, and drove into the city. The morning traffic was heavy, but the steady rhythm of the commute helped calm my racing thoughts. At my firm, I went straight to the secure printing room and watched page after page of Gavin's crimes slide into the output tray. I bound the pages into 3 identical folders, walked down to the basement level of our building, and secured them inside a fireproof safe deposit box. But a strange, unsettling feeling suddenly washed over me. It was a prickle of intuition at the base of my neck. A subtle warning from a subconscious mind that had spent years learning to anticipate the erratic behavior of desperate people. Gavin was backed into a corner, completely isolated and suffocating under the pressure of impending federal charges. I packed up my briefcase and decided to head home early. The drive back to the suburbs felt unnervingly long. I pulled into my driveway and immediately noticed something was terribly wrong. But today, a rusted, unmarked white van was idling haphazardly against the curb near my mailbox. I stepped out of my car, my eyes scanning the front of my house. The heavy wooden front door was perfectly intact and securely locked. But as I walked up the concrete path, I heard a loud metallic crunching sound echoing from the back of the property. I quietly unlatched the wooden side gate and slipped into the backyard, keeping my footsteps light against the damp grass. As I rounded the corner of the house, I saw the destruction. The large glass sliding door leading into our kitchen had been completely shattered. The heavy metal frame of the door was bent outward, clearly pried open with immense frantic force. Any normal person would have pulled out their phone and dialed the police immediately. But I knew exactly who was inside my house, and I knew exactly what he was looking for. I stepped carefully over the broken glass, my soft-soled shoes making almost no sound as I entered the kitchen. The house was a disaster zone. Drawers had been yanked out of the cabinets and dumped onto the floor. The cushions of the living room sofa were sliced open, the white stuffing spilling out onto the rug. Framed photographs had been knocked off the walls, their glass faces shattered. Gavin was tearing our marital home apart in a blind, frantic search for anything he could turn into fast cash. I moved silently down the main hallway, following the sounds of heavy, labored breathing and the rhythmic scraping of metal against metal. The noises were coming from the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. When my father passed away, I had carefully boxed up his most prized personal possessions and moved them into that room for safekeeping. Among those possessions was my father's heavy fireproof steel floor safe. My father was a man who appreciated the intricate craftsmanship of fine horology. Over his lifetime, he had amassed a stunning collection of vintage luxury watches, rare pieces from the 1960s and 70s that were currently valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars on the collector's market. Gavin knew about the watches. He had always stared at my father's wrist with poorly disguised envy at family dinners. Now facing complete financial ruin, an expiring real estate contract, and a looming federal indictment. Gavin had remembered the steel safe sitting in our guest room. He needed money to pay his elite divorce lawyer to force the commingled asset motion, and he needed it today. I stopped just outside the bedroom doorway, pressing my back against the wall to remain hidden. I slowly leaned forward and peered into the room. Gavin was kneeling on the carpet, his custom-tailored suit jacket tossed carelessly onto the bed. His crisp white dress shirt was soaked with sweat, the fabric clinging to his back, as he grunted with exertion. He was holding a massive rusted iron crowbar, violently wedging the curved edge into the narrow seam of the steel safe's heavy door. His knuckles were white, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation as he threw his entire body weight against the iron bar, trying to pry the locking mechanism apart. "Come on!" he hissed through clenched teeth, his voice cracking with panic. "Open up, you piece of garbage! Just open up for me right now." I was completely unhinged, acting less like an entitled corporate executive and more like a cornered animal clawing at a cage. He brought the crowbar down against the digital keypad, smashing the plastic buttons into pieces, hoping to trigger a mechanical release. The noise was deafening, a brutal rhythmic violence that echoed through the quiet suburban house. He was destroying everything in his path, driven entirely by the suffocating terror of his own impending consequences. I watched him for a long moment, my pulse steadying as the initial shock faded into profound clarity. This was the man who had promised to love and protect me. This was the man who had drained our life savings, forged documents to steal my family home, and sued me for financial abuse to cover up his own corporate crimes. And now he was reduced to a sweaty, desperate thief breaking into my house with a crowbar to steal the last remnants of my dead father's legacy. I did not feel afraid. I felt an overwhelming sense of power. I took a deliberate step into the doorway, letting the heel of my shoe click loudly against the hardwood floor. Gavin froze. His shoulders went completely rigid, the heavy iron crowbar hovering midair. He slowly turned his head, his chest heaving as he looked over his shoulder. When his eyes locked onto mine, all the color drained from his face. He looked absolutely pathetic, caught red-handed in the middle of a desperate, violent crime. He slowly lowered the crowbar to the carpet, his chest rising and falling rapidly, as he tried to formulate a lie to explain away the shattered glass and the smashed safe. "You should have stayed at the office, Camille." Gavin breathed out, his voice, shaking with a dangerous, unpredictable energy. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my hands completely relaxed down at my sides. "You are wasting your valuable time, Gavin," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room like a perfectly sharpened steel blade. "You are never getting into that heavy floor safe." Gavin stared at me, his chest heaving as the reality of my presence washed over him. The heavy iron crowbar slipped from his sweaty fingers and landed on the carpet with a dull thud. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of genuine shame cross his face. It was the natural reaction of a man caught red-handed in a desperate act. But that shame evaporated almost instantly, replaced by a dark, volatile fury I had never seen before. The charming, easygoing corporate executive I had married was completely gone. In his place stood a cornered, dangerous man who realized he was entirely out of options. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, closing the distance between us. The air in the guest bedroom felt suddenly thick and suffocating. He used every inch of his height to try and intimidate me. He stopped when he was barely a foot away, looming over me like a shadow. I could smell the stale sweat and the sour tang of cheap beer on his breath. My heart hammered against my ribs, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced my feet to stay planted firmly on the hardwood floor. I was not going to let him see me flinch. You think this is funny, Camille? Gavin hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. You think you are so incredibly smart standing there judging me. You have absolutely no idea what is actually happening right now. You have no idea what is at stake. I looked up at him, maintaining unbroken eye contact. I know exactly what is happening, Gavin. I know you are destroying my father's house because you are completely broke. I know you drained our savings and fabricated a lease for Melanie. And I know you are never getting into that safe because my father had it bolted directly into the foundation concrete and reinforced with solid steel. You are making a fool of yourself. Gavin's hands curled into tight fists at his sides. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin. He took another step forward, forcing me to tilt my head back just to keep looking at him. I am not playing games with you anymore, he growled, raising his voice so it echoed off the bare walls of the guest room. I need untraceable liquid cash right now, and I know your father kept a fortune in vintage Rolex watches in this house. You are going to open that safe, or you are going to call Mr. Gallagher and authorize a massive cash disbursement from the trust today. I kept my expression carefully blank, letting him dig his own grave with every word. I cannot do that, Gavin, I said, keeping my tone soft and artificially hesitant, perfectly playing the role of a frightened wife, trying to reason with an unreasonable man. The trust is completely locked. You heard Mr. Gallagher. There is a financial stability clause. You quit your job. The assets are frozen indefinitely. I cannot just call my lawyer and magically undo a legal safeguard that you triggered yourself. Gavin let out a short, manic laugh. He reached out and grabbed my upper arms, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. The sudden contact sent a jolt of genuine fear through my system, but I forced myself to remain completely limp in his grasp. Do not lie to me, he shouted, shaking me slightly. Do not quote legal jargon to me like I am an idiot. I know how these rich family trusts work. The primary beneficiary can always petition the trustee for an emergency hardship disbursement. You can get that money unlocked if you really want to. You are just choosing to watch me drown because you are a spiteful, vindictive woman. He released my arms, shoving me backward just enough to make me stumble against the doorframe. He began pacing the narrow space between the bed and the safe, running his hands frantically through his sweat-soaked hair. You do not understand what I am facing, he muttered, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. I made a mistake, Camille, a massive corporate mistake at the firm. I needed $400,000 in place before Monday morning to cover a discrepancy in my client ledgers. I missed that deadline. Now I need the money before the investigators lock the accounts and finish tracing everything back to me, or my entire life is completely over. I am going to lose my career, my license, everything. I watched him confess to felony embezzlement right in front of me, wrapping his crimes in the sanitized language of a corporate mistake. How was actually trying to make me feel sorry for him. He wanted me to believe bailing him out of a federal crime was my duty as his wife. Why should I help you cover up a crime, I asked, letting a tremor of fear bleed into my voice to keep him talking. You filed for divorce. You stole our life savings to buy your mother a house. Why would I ever ask Mr. Gallagher to empty my father's trust to save you from your own actions? Gavin stopped pacing. He turned to face me, his eyes wide and devoid of humanity. Because if you do not help me, I will completely destroy your life, he threatened, his voice dropping back down to that terrifying, deadly whisper. You think this commingled asset motion is a headache. That is just the beginning. If you do not call Gallagher right now and get me that money, I will drag this divorce out for a decade. I will tie up your precious commercial real estate in so much litigation that you will never see a single dime of rental income. I will hire financial investigators to audit every tax return your father ever filed. I will bury you in legal fees until you are forced to sell this house to pay your attorneys. And I will not stop there, Camille. I will go to your corporate accounting firm. I will tell your senior partners that you were fully aware of my financial discrepancies and that you actively helped me hide the money. I will launch a smear campaign so vicious that your professional reputation will be absolutely ruined. You will lose your forensic accounting license. You will never work in this city again. You will be as broke and desperate as I am right now. Do you understand me? You are going to give me that money, or I will take you down with me. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own extortion. I looked at him, my eyes wide, playing the part of the terrified, defeated wife to absolute perfection. I let a heavy silence fill the room. "You are extorting me," I whispered, making sure my voice sounded broken. Gavin scoffed, turning away in disgust. "Call it whatever you want, Camille. I call it survival. You have until our mediation session to get that trust unlocked and write me a check for $1 million. That covers my mistake and my mother's house. If you do not have a cashier's check sitting on that conference table, I burn your entire world to ashes." He looked around the destroyed bedroom, his eyes frantically searching for anything he could take right now. He knew he could not crack the floor safe, but his gaze suddenly locked onto a polished mahogany display box sitting on the top shelf of the closet. Gavin's eyes lit up with greedy desperation. He shoved past me, marching over to the closet. He grabbed the box, tucking it tightly under his arm. "I am taking these as a down payment," he announced. "Do not test me, Camille." He stormed out of the room, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. I heard the front door slam loudly. I stood still. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen displayed a bright red recording timer. I pressed stop. I looked at the empty shelf and smiled, knowing the watches in that safe box were cheap replicas my father used as decoys. I did not bother cleaning up the mess he left behind. I simply locked the bedroom door, walked into my office, and added the audio recording to the master dossier I had built. I had him. I had his confession to felony extortion, his admission of the corporate embezzlement, and his physical destruction of my property. I slept peacefully that night, perhaps the first truly restful sleep I had experienced since my father passed away. The following morning, my encrypted email portal pinged with an urgent message from Mr. Gallagher. I called him immediately. He sounded deeply concerned, his usual measured tone replaced by a sense of professional urgency. He explained that Hastings and Mercer, the aggressive law firm representing Gavin, had officially filed a motion requesting an emergency mediation session. They were pushing the narrative hard, leaning entirely on the $5,000 bonus Gavin had deposited into the trust holding account. They were extremely confident in their commingled assets loophole. Mr. Gallagher warned me that family court judges in our state often preferred mediation over protracted litigation, especially when complex real estate assets were involved. They sent over a preliminary settlement offer, Mr. Gallagher told me, sounding disgusted by the terms. They are framing it as a generous compromise to spare everyone the pain of a public trial. I sat at my desk looking out the window at the quiet suburban street. "Tell me what he wants," I said calmly. Mr. Gallagher sighed heavily. "Gavin is offering to completely drop his claims of financial abuse and withdraw the motion regarding the commingled assets. In exchange, he is demanding that you instruct me to liquidate one of the smaller commercial properties immediately. He wants a cashier's check for exactly $1 million tax-free handed over at the mediation table. If you agree, he will sign an uncontested divorce decree and walk away. If you refuse, his lawyers are threatening to drag this out for years, subpoenaing every financial record your father ever generated and freezing your entire portfolio in the process." It was the exact threat Gavin had made in my guest bedroom, now sanitized and formalized through expensive legal channels. He needed $400,000 to cover the stolen corporate funds, and he was inflating the demand to $1 million so he could secure his mother's luxury villa and pay off his legal fees. He was trying to use the legal system as a weapon of extortion, completely convinced that I was terrified of a public battle. I thought I would pay any price just to protect my father's legacy and make the nightmare stop. "Tell them we will attend the mediation," I told Mr. Gallagher. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Camille, you do not have to accept this extortion. We can fight the commingling claim. I have already isolated the deposit. I know you have," I reassured him, "and I am not going to give him a single dime, but I want him in that room. I want his lawyers there. I want everything documented on the official mediation record. Accept the earliest available session 2 days from now. Tell them we are open to discussing the settlement." After I ended the call with Mr. Gallagher, my old cell phone buzzed on the corner of my desk. I picked it up and saw a new text message notification. It was from Barbara. She could never resist the urge to gloat when she thought she had the upper hand. I read her message, the sheer entitlement radiating from every word. Gavin's lawyers told us about the settlement offer, Barbara wrote. You should really just pay up, Camille. Save yourself the embarrassment of a long public trial. You know Gavin is going to win half of that estate anyway. $1 million is a bargain for your freedom. Do the smart thing and write the check so we can all move on with our lives. Do not let your stubborn pride leave you with absolutely nothing. I read the message twice, marveling at her delusion. She actually believed her son was a brilliant strategist. She believed they had backed me into an inescapable corner. She had absolutely no idea that her son was currently sitting on a pile of fake watches, sweating through his custom suit, waiting for the federal authorities to knock down his door. I did not reply to her message. I took a screenshot of it and dropped it into the evidence folder right next to Gavin's audio confession. They were so eager to document their own greed. I was more than happy to oblige them. I had exactly 2 days until the mediation session. I spent that time preparing with absolute surgical precision. I printed out the 50-page forensic audit I had compiled verifying every single routing number, offshore account balance, and fraudulent loan application. I placed the audio recording of Gavin's extortion on a secure digital drive. I had everything I needed to dismantle his entire legal strategy, but I wanted more than just a victory in family court. I wanted absolute, undeniable justice. I wanted the people he had stolen from to be in the room when his house of cards finally collapsed. The following afternoon, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had acquired during my deep dive into Gavin's corporate background. I did not call the police, and I did not call the local authorities. I called the direct private line of the chief corporate counsel at the private wealth management firm Gavin had just fled from. A woman with a sharp professional voice answered the phone. I introduced myself, clearly stating my name and my relationship to Gavin. I could immediately hear the shift in her tone. The firm was already deep into their internal investigation, staring down a massive deficit in their senior client portfolios. They knew Gavin had disappeared, and they were scrambling to contain the fallout before it hit the press. I understand your firm is currently facing a rather significant compliance emergency regarding a missing balance of $400,000, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and authoritative. I also understand that Gavin was scheduled for a disciplinary hearing on Monday morning, which he obviously failed to attend. The corporate counsel paused, her caution evident. I cannot confirm or deny any internal investigations, Mrs. Henderson. What exactly is the purpose of this call? The purpose of this call is to offer you the exact location of your missing capital, I replied smoothly. I am a licensed forensic accountant. I have spent the last 4 days conducting a comprehensive audit of my husband's private digital footprint. I have the routing numbers for the intermediary shell accounts, the registration details for his offshore limited liability company in the Caribbean, and a complete itemized ledger of every dollar he siphoned from your elderly clients. I also have a crystal-clear audio recording of him explicitly confessing to the embezzlement. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I had her full undivided attention. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I continued. My husband and his legal team are forcing me into an emergency mediation session at the offices of Hastings and Mercer. He is attempting to extort $1 million from my father's estate to secretly repay your firm before you go to the federal authorities. I am formally inviting you and your legal representatives to attend this meeting. I will be handing over a complete, court-admissible forensic dossier that hands you your entire case on a silver platter. I suggest you bring federal investigators with you. It is going to be a very lucrative financial disclosure meeting. There was a brief moment of stunned quiet before the corporate counsel spoke again, her voice entirely stripped of its previous caution. We will be there, she promised. I hung up the phone and looked out the window of my home office. The trap was fully set. Gavin thought he was walking into a room to claim his unearned millions. He thought he was going to walk away clean, leaving me broken and his victims none the wiser. He had no idea that the room he was walking into was actually a cage, and I was holding the only key. I packed my heavy leather briefcase, sliding the thick-bound audit report inside. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. The grief over my father was still there. A quiet ache in my chest, but it was now wrapped in a fierce protective armor. I was ready for Wednesday. I was ready to burn Gavin's world to the ground. Finally, mediation morning arrived. I walked into the downtown offices of Hastings and Mercer alongside Mr. Gallagher. We were guided into a massive glass-walled conference room. The center of the room was dominated by a polished mahogany table. I took my seat next to Mr. Gallagher, placing my heavy leather briefcase on the floor beside my chair. I folded my hands and waited silently, preparing for the battle ahead. 10 minutes later, Gavin strolled into the room. He was dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit, complete with a silk pocket square and a confident smile. He projected the false confidence of a wealthy executive. The desperate man who had been violently swinging an iron crowbar in my guest bedroom was hidden beneath expensive fabric. Right behind him walked his mother, Barbara. She carried herself with the haughty entitlement of a conquering queen, wearing a pristine white pantsuit. Because her name was attached to the pending real estate contract in Palm Springs, Gavin's legal team successfully argued for her inclusion as an interested third party. She took the seat across from me, her eyes locking onto mine with undisguised contempt. Gavin sat next to his mother, flanked by his lead attorney, an aggressive man named Harrison Caldwell. A neutral court-appointed mediator named Mr. Sullivan sat at the head of the long table. Mr. Sullivan organized his legal pads and formally opened the mediation session. He explained the ground rules, reminding everyone that any factual admissions or formal demands made during this meeting would be documented on the official mediation record. I reached into my bag, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and uncapped my pen. I looked directly at Gavin, offering him a polite smile. He smirked back, clearly interpreting my silence as submission. He thought my quiet demeanor meant I had been broken. Mr. Sullivan turned the floor over to Harrison Caldwell. The lawyer immediately launched into a theatrical monologue designed to paint me as a manipulative sociopath. He paced behind his chair, weaving a narrative of absolute victimhood for his client. He claimed that I had spent years emotionally suffocating my husband. According to Caldwell, I had deceitfully coerced Gavin into abandoning his lucrative corporate career by promising him a life of shared wealth following the tragic passing of my father. The moment Gavin handed in his resignation, Caldwell argued I had maliciously sprung a trap. He told the mediator that I had intentionally frozen our marital assets, illegally locked my husband out of our shared home, and left him and his aging mother destitute out of pure spite. I sat perfectly still, my face remaining an impassive mask as I listened to the lawyer assassinate my character. I did not interrupt. I simply let my pen glide across the yellow legal pad, carefully noting the specific claims they were entering into the official record. I wanted them to feel entirely unchallenged. I needed them to put every single one of their extortionate demands into the formal mediation transcript. Every lie Caldwell spun about Gavin's forced resignation, every false claim about his supposed financial desperation, only made the trap I had built that much stronger. Caldwell finally pivoted to their demands. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished mahogany table. "We have established an undeniable legal precedent regarding the commingled nature of the trust assets," Caldwell stated, his voice ringing with certainty. "My client deposited a $5,000 performance bonus directly into the primary holding account. By state law, that single deposit pierces the protective veil of the entire trust. The $5 million commercial real estate portfolio is now subject to equitable division. If we take this to trial, a family court judge will absolutely order the immediate liquidation of those properties, and my client will be awarded $2.5 million. Caldwell paused. However, he continued, his tone shifting to false magnanimity. "My client is a reasonable man. He has no desire to drag his grieving wife through a brutal public trial. He does not want to force the liquidation of your father's entire life work. So we are prepared to offer a generous compromise today. We demand that you instruct your attorney, Mr. Gallagher, to unfreeze the trust immediately. You will authorize the sale of one of the smaller commercial properties in your portfolio. You will provide my client with a cashier's check for exactly $1 million entirely tax-free by the close of business tomorrow." In exchange for this $1 million settlement, my client will fully withdraw his spousal support claims. He will drop the commingled asset motion entirely. He will sign an uncontested divorce decree, and he will walk out of your life forever. You get to keep your remaining $4 million and your father's legacy, and my client gets the basic financial security he requires to rebuild his life. It is a clean, swift resolution that spares everyone a tremendous amount of pain. Before Mr. Gallagher could respond, Barbara leaned forward. She looked at me with an expression of profound, condescending pity. "You really should just take the deal, Camille," she said, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "You have been incredibly selfish through this entire process. Gavin is offering you a gracious way out. I have a closing agent waiting for my call regarding the Palm Springs property. If you do not authorize that $1 million check today, we will lose that house and my son will make sure you lose everything you have ever cared about. Sign the settlement and give us what we are owed." I kept my eyes locked on Barbara, absorbing the sheer arrogance of her words. She was openly admitting to the extortion on the record. She was demanding $1 million of my father's money to fund her luxury retirement, using the threat of a prolonged legal war as leverage. She was so blinded by her own greed that she could not see the massive legal jeopardy she was exposing herself to. I wrote down her exact quote on my legal pad, dotting the period with a satisfying press of ink. Mr. Gallagher shifted in his seat beside me, clearly bristling at the blatant intimidation tactics, but he followed my strict instructions. He remained perfectly silent, waiting for my signal. Gavin smiled, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking incredibly pleased with the performance his mother and his lawyer had just delivered. He thought he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He believed that the threat to my father's real estate empire was the ultimate trump card. He was completely convinced that I was a terrified, grieving widow who would pay any price just to make the harassment stop and protect my family's legacy. Mr. Sullivan, the mediator, cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked across the table at me, his expression carefully neutral, but carrying a hint of sympathy. He had seen aggressive lawyers bully spouses into terrible settlements before. "Mrs. Henderson," Mr. Sullivan said softly, "opposing counsel has laid out a formal settlement offer. They have placed their demands on the official record. Do you or your legal counsel have a response or a counter-offer you would like to present at this time?" The entire room fell silent. Gavin watched me carefully, his arrogant smirk firmly fixed in place. Barbara tapped her manicured fingernails impatiently against the polished mahogany. Caldwell stood tall, looking like a predator waiting for its prey to finally surrender to him. I slowly placed my silver pen down on the yellow legal pad. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the moment stretch out just a fraction longer. Then I reached down into the heavy leather briefcase resting by my feet. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a settlement agreement. I pulled out a thick 50-page document securely bound in a professional black cover. I placed the heavy stack of paper on the table and calmly, silently slid the forensic audit report all the way across the polished mahogany surface until it came to a dead stop directly in front of Gavin's hands. Gavin looked down at the heavy black binder resting against his fingertips. He let out a short, dismissive breath, glancing at his lawyer with a look of shared amusement. He clearly thought I had handed him a printed emotional plea or a pathetic list of financial concessions meant to beg for mercy. Harrison Caldwell picked up the binder, his arrogant demeanor still entirely intact, and flipped open the heavy cover. He expected to find a surrender. Instead, he found a meticulously catalogued criminal indictment. I kept my voice completely steady, stripping away every ounce of emotion until I sounded exactly like the seasoned forensic accountant I was. I told them to turn to page 4. I watched Caldwell turn the crisp white pages, his eyes scanning the dense rows of financial data. I began my presentation by formally introducing Apex Crest Holdings. I detailed the offshore limited liability company registered in the Caribbean, identifying the proxy agent and reading Gavin's hidden college email address directly into the official mediation record. I saw the muscles in Gavin's jaw instantly lock. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden rigid terror. I did not stop there. I directed the mediator to page 12 where I had highlighted the flow of stolen capital in bright red ink. I explained the precise methodology Gavin had used to siphon funds from the portfolios of his most vulnerable elderly clients. I listed the exact dates, the specific domestic intermediary accounts, and the final international wire transfers. I stated the total sum of $400,000, articulating every single syllable so the number would echo in the glass-walled room. Gavin gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him, resulting in a pathetic, choked sound. Harrison Caldwell stopped taking notes. The expensive silver pen slipped from his fingers and rolled softly across the polished table. The aggressive theatrical attorney who had spent the last 20 minutes assassinating my character was suddenly staring at the spreadsheet as if it were a venomous snake. As a seasoned legal professional, Caldwell instantly recognized the depth of the jeopardy his client was in. More importantly, he recognized that he had just formally demanded a $1 million settlement based on a foundation of felony corporate embezzlement and bank fraud. The color completely drained from Caldwell's face, leaving his skin a pale ashen gray. Barbara looked frantically between her son and the lawyer, her previous haughty confidence unraveling into sheer confusion. She demanded to know what the document meant, but Gavin was physically incapable of answering her. He tried to shake his head, a weak attempt to deny the irrefutable paper trail sitting right in front of him. The mediator. Mr. Sullivan leaned forward, adjusting his glasses to closely examine the pages I had referenced. He was no longer looking at this as a standard divorce settlement. He was looking at a major financial crime unfolding in real time. I turned my attention back to Caldwell, who was now frantically flipping through the subsequent pages of the audit. I informed the room that the retainer fee paid to Hastings and Mercer was secured through a fraudulent personal loan. I explained how Gavin had fabricated documents regarding my father's estate to acquire $30,000 from a predatory online lender. Caldwell slammed the binder shut, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at his client with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound professional terror. But I was far from finished. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen, maximizing the volume, and pressed play on the audio file I had recorded in my ruined guest bedroom. Gavin's own voice filled the silent conference room, harsh and desperate. The high-quality audio captured every single word of his violent extortion. It captured him admitting to the massive corporate mistake that required $400,000 by Monday morning. It captured him demanding the trust money to cover up his crimes before the compliance auditors sat down at their desks. It captured him explicitly threatening to destroy my professional reputation, drag out the divorce for a decade, and bankrupt me with legal fees if I did not hand over a cashier's check for $1 million. The recording echoed off the glass walls, the ugly truth of his character laid bare for everyone to hear. Everyone in the room listened in absolute horror as the digital playback captured the sound of his heavy footsteps and the violent crash of him destroying my father's property in his blind search for valuables. Barbara let out a sharp gasp, pressing both of her hands over her mouth. She finally realized that the man she had been defending was not an innocent victim of a cruel wife, but a desperate criminal who had been lying to her from the very beginning. The recording ended with the heavy slam of my front door. The silence that followed was entirely suffocating. I locked eyes with Gavin, watching him drown in the consequences of his own hubris. The charming facade he had worn when he first walked into the room was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, frantic stare of a man who knew he had nowhere left to run. I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I sat perfectly upright, folding my hands together on the polished mahogany table, and waited for his final reaction. But the instinct for self-preservation in a cornered animal is incredibly strong. Gavin slammed both of his hands onto the table, pushing himself up so roughly that his heavy leather chair hit the wall behind him with a loud crack. His eyes were wide and completely manic, darting around the conference room as if looking for a physical escape route. He pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed that none of the corporate money mattered in this room. He shouted that the family court did not care about offshore accounts or internal corporate investigations. He insisted with a wild, terrifying desperation that he still held the absolute legal right to force the sale of my father's commercial properties. He frantically reminded the mediator that he had deposited a $5,000 performance bonus into the estate holding account, fiercely asserting that the commingled asset claim was an impenetrable legal reality that would force my hand regardless of his other actions. "You cannot touch the real estate!" Gavin screamed, his voice cracking under the immense strain of his panic. "The law is the law. I put my own money into that account. It is commingled marital property now, and you cannot stop a judge from ordering the liquidation. I still win this divorce. I will still get my $1 million, and there is nothing your spreadsheets can do to change that fact." I smiled, a calm and genuine expression of absolute victory that finally reached my eyes. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and instructed everyone to turn to page 40 of the forensic audit report. I waited until Caldwell, Mr. Sullivan, and even Barbara had flipped to the designated section. I revealed that the moment Gavin's $5,000 electronic deposit attempted to hit the primary holding account, Mr. Gallagher had immediately flagged the incoming transaction as unauthorized. Because of the strict parameters set by the Financial Stability Clause, the receiving bank was under explicit standing orders to reject external domestic deposits. The funds were instantly quarantined in a separate, completely isolated escrow ledger pending a formal legal review by the trust administrators. The money had remained suspended in that digital purgatory since Friday. I watched the last drop of hope drain completely from my husband's terrified eyes, as I slowly and deliberately informed him that his dirty, desperate money had never actually touched a single cent of my father's legacy. It never commingled. The absolute checkmate was finalized, and there was no way out. He was entirely defeated, stripped of his leverage, and exposed as a criminal. The meticulous trap I had set had closed around him with flawless, unbreakable precision. He had lost to me, but I was not finished. Proving the $5,000 deposit had never commingled destroyed Gavin's last argument for forcing a liquidation. It did not yet explain why Mr. Gallagher had remained so calm while Gavin forged documents, threatened the trust, and used the mediation itself as leverage. I placed one hand on the black binder and turned several pages forward. "There is one more provision you have not discussed," I said. Gavin's breathing was ragged. His lawyer, Harrison Caldwell, looked as if he wanted the meeting to end before another sentence could be entered into the record. Mr. Sullivan, the mediator, glanced toward Mr. Gallagher. My father's attorney gave a small nod. "Page 46, I said. Secondary protection clause." Barbara frowned. "What secondary protection clause?" Mr. Gallagher answered this time. He explained that my father had anticipated more than simple financial irresponsibility. The trust contained a second enforcement mechanism designed for deliberate attempts to seize, encumber, falsify claims against, or coerce access to trust property. If a spouse or related claimant used fraud, forged documents, sham tenancy instruments, or extortionate legal pressure to obtain trust assets, that conduct triggered what the document called a total disinheritance and liability shift. Gavin laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "I am not even named in the will. You cannot disinherit someone who was never a beneficiary." "That is precisely why the clause is broader than a normal forfeiture provision," Mr. Gallagher said. "It bars you from asserting any derivative marital, equitable occupancy reimbursement or settlement claim against the trust. More importantly, once triggered, the costs and damages created by the fraudulent attempt can be shifted away from the trust and onto the person who caused them. Legal fees, property damage, administrative expenses, losses caused by fraudulent filings. The trust does not pay to defend itself from the fraudster. The fraudster becomes personally exposed." For the first time that morning, Gavin stopped shouting. I slid a certified copy of Melanie's lease across the table. The forged signature of my father sat at the bottom, like a confession written in someone else's name. Beside it, I placed the metadata report, showing that the file had been created on Gavin's laptop at 2:14 in the afternoon on October 12th, 2 days after my father died. "This was the first trigger," I said. "You fabricated a lease to manufacture a tenancy inside trust property. You gave it to Melanie so she could occupy the lake house and force the estate into a 90-day civil eviction process. Melanie signed nothing." Barbara snapped automatically. Gavin was only helping his sister. Mr. Gallagher's eyes hardened. Helping someone occupy estate property through a forged instrument is exactly the conduct the clause addresses. I placed my phone beside the lease. And this was the second trigger. Your son broke into my home, tried to steal my father's watches, admitted. He needed trust money to cover his corporate problem, and threatened to destroy my career and bury the estate in litigation unless I paid him $1 million. Then his legal team carried the same demand into this mediation. Caldwell raised a hand sharply. I need to be very clear that my firm had no knowledge of any break-in, forged lease, or criminal source of funds before today. I looked directly at him. The record will reflect that distinction. The mediator made a note. Caldwell's shoulders dropped by a fraction, but Gavin looked worse. He had finally understood that losing the commingling theory did not simply leave him with nothing. His own tactics had converted the trust from a locked vault into a shield pointed directly back at him. Mr. Gallagher opened a thin folder of his own. He stated for the record that the trustees had formally determined the secondary clause was triggered when the forged lease and Gavin's coercive demand were authenticated. From that moment, Gavin was barred from claiming any benefit through Camille's inheritance, and the trust reserved the right to seek reimbursement from him for administrative costs, property losses, and legal expenses caused by the scheme. Any hope that he could use the divorce court as a backdoor into my father's estate was gone. Gavin stared at the documents and whispered that the clause was unfair. Unfair, I repeated. You forged my dead father's signature, stole our savings, broke into my house, and threatened to destroy my career unless I financed your crimes. My father did not make the clause unfair. He made it accurate. Barbara's face tightened with sudden fear. She looked at Mr. Gallagher instead of me. If Gavin is personally liable, what happens to the Palm Springs contract? Nothing about the trust changes your contract, Mr. Gallagher replied. The trust never signed it. Camille never signed it. You did. The words landed hard. Barbara sank back against her chair. I turned to the final tab in the binder. There was another reason I had insisted on an in-person mediation rather than trading settlement letters through lawyers. The previous afternoon, after authenticating the lease metadata, I had authorized Mr. Gallagher to forward the evidence concerning the forged document and the damage at the lake house to the local prosecutor. I had also provided the chief corporate counsel at Gavin's former firm with a secured copy of the financial audit and the audio recording. I was not asking any of them to trust my interpretation. I was giving them the underlying record so their own investigators could verify every transaction independently. Gavin's eyes snapped toward me. You sent them my files? No, I said. I sent them evidence of what you did. I also made sure the original records remained preserved under documented chain of custody, so no one in this room could dismiss the referral as a private marital accusation. Every figure in the binder could be independently checked against the firm's own books. Nothing about the referral depended on my interpretation, emotion, memory, or testimony alone in that room. The conference room door opened before he could answer. The woman I had spoken with from Gavin's former firm stepped inside carrying a slim litigation case. Her expression was controlled, almost clinical. Two men entered behind her in dark suits. They did not wear dramatic raid jackets or make a theatrical announcement. They simply showed their credentials to Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Gallagher before taking positions near the door. Federal financial investigators. Gavin went perfectly still. The corporate counsel introduced herself for the record and stated that her firm had reviewed the materials I provided. Their internal ledgers independently matched the routing map in my report. The missing client funds the intermediary transfers, and the account controlled by Apex Crest Holdings aligned with evidence their compliance team had already been gathering. She also confirmed that the investigators beside her were handling the federal referral arising from those records. Caldwell slowly turned toward Gavin. His face had lost all color. Gavin looked back at the 50-page binder as if he were seeing it for the first time. Until that moment, he had believed it was a weapon for mediation, something designed to frighten him into dropping his divorce demands. He had not understood why I had documented every routing number, preserved every timestamp, authenticated every file, and built a complete chain of custody. I closed the binder gently. This audit was never just my counteroffer, I said. It is a completed criminal referral. The last trace of arrogance disappeared from Gavin's face. His eyes moved from me to the corporate counsel, then to the two federal investigators standing between him and the only exit. He finally understood the architecture of the trap. The forged lease had destroyed his access to the trust. The extortion had shifted liability onto him. The quarantine deposit had killed his commingling theory. And the financial audit had already traveled beyond this room into the hands of the people who could prosecute the $400,000 theft. For several seconds, no one spoke. Even Barbara seemed unable to breathe. The mediation had ended in everything but name. Gavin had arrived expecting $1 million check. Instead, he was sitting beside the evidence that could take his money, his career, his freedom, and every remaining lie away from him. The silence shattered the moment my words registered. Harrison Caldwell stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The aggressive attorney who spent the morning bullying me was visibly trembling. He looked at the forensic audit as if it were an explosive device. Caldwell knew what it meant to present a settlement demand based on fraudulent documents and stolen funds. His professional license was in jeopardy. He turned to Gavin with absolute disgust. Caldwell pulled out a pen and gathered his legal pads. He looked directly at the mediator and stated in an unwavering voice that he was formally withdrawing as legal counsel for his client effective immediately. He announced on the record that he refused to represent a client actively engaged in felony corporate embezzlement, bank fraud, and document fabrication. Without waiting for a response, Caldwell turned on his heel and marched out of the conference room, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him. The sound of the door closing echoed like a gunshot, finalizing Gavin's isolation. The corporate counsel remained standing near the entrance, flanked by two federal investigators, whose presence now made terrifying sense. Gavin stared at the empty space where his lawyer had been sitting seconds ago. The last pillar of his defense had collapsed, leaving him entirely exposed to the consequences of his greed. He looked at the federal investigators, and then he looked back at me. The realization that he was truly trapped, that there were no more loopholes or lies left to save him, finally broke him. His legs gave out beneath him. Gavin fell to his knees on the carpeted floor, dropping the facade of the successful executive entirely. The man who had confidently demanded $1 million was now weeping openly. He crawled forward, pressing his face against the edge of the table. He began to beg. His voice cracked as he sobbed, pleading with me to tell the investigators it was all a misunderstanding. He cried out that we were married, that we were supposed to protect each other, and that he would do anything I wanted if I called off the corporate lawyers. I sat perfectly still, looking down at him with profound detachment. I felt nothing for the pathetic, sobbing man kneeling on the floor. I did not feel anger or pity or sorrow. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of relief that the parasite was finally being permanently removed from my daily life. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I let his desperate apologies hang in the empty air, serving as the absolute undeniable proof of his own profound guilt. Across the table, Barbara was experiencing her own terrifying reckoning. She had spent the meeting gloating about her luxury retirement villa and demanding a check to fund her lifestyle. Now she sat frozen, staring at the forensic audit report with panicked eyes. The reality crashed down upon her in crushing waves. The $60,000 deposit Gavin had stolen from my savings account was gone, forever seized by the real estate brokerage. She had eagerly signed a legally binding cash offer contract for a property she could not afford. Without the settlement she had tried to extort from me, she was going to default on the purchase. The sellers would file a massive civil lawsuit against her for breach of contract, a battle that would wipe out whatever modest savings she possessed. Her dreams of a private pool evaporated, leaving behind a nightmare of crushing debt and public humiliation. Barbara snapped out of her paralyzed state and directed her panic toward me. Her face flushed red as she stood up and slammed her hands onto the table. She opened her mouth to scream at me, prepared to unleash another vicious tirade blaming me for the destruction of her family. But before she could utter a single hateful word, her handbag began to vibrate violently against the polished wood. She snatched the phone from her bag and answered it aggressively, annoyed by the interruption. The moment she pressed the device to her ear, her angry expression completely dissolved into sheer horror. Through the acoustics of the room, I could clearly hear the frantic, hysterical screaming coming from the other end of the line. It was Melanie. My sister-in-law was shrieking so loudly that her voice distorted over the cellular connection. She was crying hysterically, screaming for her mother to help her, and begging for Gavin to send a lawyer immediately. Between frantic sobs, Melanie wailed that the local police had just kicked down the front door of the lake house. The officers had arrived with a formal arrest warrant based on the digital forensic evidence I had submitted to the local prosecutor. They had matched the metadata from the fraudulent lease agreement directly to Gavin's laptop, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the document was backdated and forged. Melanie sobbed into the phone, screaming that she was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser in handcuffs, being formally charged with felony forgery, trespassing, and the willful destruction of private property. Barbara's phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the mahogany table, the screen cracking against the hard surface. Melanie's distant, hysterical wailing continued to echo from the dropped device. Barbara slowly sank back into her chair, all the fight draining out of her body. She looked at her son weeping on the floor, waiting to be placed in federal custody. She thought about her daughter being booked into the county jail. She thought about the impending breach of contract lawsuit that was going to strip away everything she owned. The arrogant matriarch who had publicly shamed me and gleefully participated in my planned financial ruin finally understood the magnitude of what they had done. She buried her face in her hands and broke down into heavy, agonizing sobs. The destruction of their family was absolute and entirely of their own making. They had tried to exploit my grief, manipulate my marriage, and steal my father's legacy. They had believed their own lies and underestimated my intelligence at every single turn. Now they were drowning in the devastating consequences of their sheer, limitless greed. I had given them exactly enough rope to hang themselves, and they had eagerly tied the knot. I calmly placed the cap back onto my silver pen and slipped it into the inner pocket of my blazer. I reached down and picked up my heavy leather briefcase, feeling the solid weight of the remaining documents inside. I stood up from my chair, taking my time to smooth the wrinkles from my professional attire. I reached forward and slowly buttoned the center button of my black blazer, projecting an aura of complete, unbothered composure. I looked at the corporate counsel and the federal investigators, offering them a polite, professional nod. They stepped aside, allowing me a clear path to the door. I did not look down at Gavin crying on the carpet. I did not offer Barbara a parting word. I simply turned around and walked out of the glass-walled conference room without casting a single backward glance. I left them to face the authorities and the wreckage of their lives. 1 month later, I was sitting behind a polished desk in my executive office. The large windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the downtown district, a physical representation of the commercial real estate empire I now controlled. I was reviewing a complex financial restructuring plan, utilizing my forensic accounting background to streamline the business. The grief over my father was still a quiet presence, but it was no longer a debilitating fog. It had transformed into a profound sense of purpose. I had successfully protected the legacy he spent his life building. I paused my work and glanced up at the television mounted on the wall. A breaking news banner flashed across the screen, catching my attention. I unmuted the volume just as the news anchor began to speak. The ticker announced the formal federal indictment of a former private wealth manager for a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. I leaned back in my leather chair, resting my hands on the armrests, as a satisfied smile touched my lips. The camera on the news broadcast panned to live footage of Gavin being escorted out of the federal courthouse after his initial appearance. He wore a plain detention uniform, his wrists secured as marshals guided him through a line of reporters. The custom-tailored suits, silk pocket squares, and entitled smirks were gone. The anchor explained that a federal grand jury had indicted him on multiple counts tied to wire fraud, bank fraud, and the $400,000 embezzlement scheme. Prosecutors were also seeking restitution for the elderly clients whose accounts had been targeted. The case was only beginning, but the indictment meant the private panic Gavin had tried to hide was now part of the public record. I muted the television and returned to the restructuring plan on my desk. I no longer needed instant punishment to feel safe. The evidence was preserved, the trust was protected, and the justice system had finally taken control of the consequences he had spent so long trying to push onto me. Months later, after the financial records had been independently verified and the criminal case moved through federal court, Gavin pleaded guilty to the principal fraud and embezzlement charges. The judge imposed a substantial federal prison sentence and ordered restitution, emphasizing the deliberate targeting of vulnerable clients and the elaborate steps Gavin had taken to conceal the money. By then, the result no longer felt like revenge. It felt like arithmetic. Every forged document, hidden transfer threat, and lie had added another line to a ledger he eventually had to settle himself. The ripple effects of Gavin's federal incarceration completely decimated the rest of his family. Barbara learned the hard way that high-end real estate brokers and luxury property developers do not care about family drama, and they certainly do not care about sob stories. When Friday afternoon arrived, and the remaining $400,000 balance for the Palm Springs villa was not wired into the escrow account, the sellers immediately executed their legal right to sue her for breach of contract. Because Gavin had deliberately used his mother's name on the binding cash offer, attempting to keep the asset hidden from my forensic tracking, she was held entirely personally liable for the staggering financial damages. The resulting civil lawsuit drained her completely dry. To satisfy the court-ordered judgments, Barbara was forced to quickly liquidate her own comfortable suburban home at a massive loss. She had to sell her luxury sedan, drain her meager retirement accounts, and pawn the designer handbags and expensive jewelry she used to flaunt at her country club luncheons. When the dust finally settled from the brutal civil litigation, Barbara was left with virtually nothing. She moved into a tiny, rundown one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, miles away from the affluent, manicured neighborhoods she used to roam. The wealthy social circle she had spent years carefully cultivating dropped her immediately. The women who used to attend her lavish dinner parties stopped returning her calls, deeply embarrassed by the highly public federal indictment of her son and the scandalous nature of her own financial ruin. She was completely shunned, forced to live out her golden years in the exact kind of quiet, isolated poverty she had always mocked others for enduring. She had tried to extort $1 million from a grieving widow, and the universe had responded by taking everything she possessed. Melanie did not fare any better in the aftermath of their collective greed. Her arrogant, destructive stunt at my father's lake house earned her a permanent criminal record. She was formally charged by the district attorney with felony forgery, trespassing, and the willful destruction of private property. Because Gavin was sitting in a federal holding cell, awaiting transfer to a penitentiary, and Barbara was drowning under the weight of her civil lawsuits, there was absolutely no one left to bail Melanie out of her own spectacular mess. She managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by accepting a strict multi-year probation agreement, but the judge showed her no mercy financially. She was ordered to pay massive court fines and full restitution for the severe damage she caused to my father's antique furniture and the hardwood floors. Saddled with staggering legal fees, massive credit card debt, and no wealthy brother to fund her reckless shopping addictions, Melanie was finally forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. She took a job working grueling double shifts as a waitress at a greasy 24-hour diner just off the interstate highway. Her days of broadcasting a fake, glamorous lifestyle to her social media followers were permanently over. The designer dresses and expensive champagne bottles were replaced by a stained uniform, sore feet, minimum wage, and the relentless, suffocating pressure of paying off a mountain of debt she could no longer run away from. She had demanded a free luxury house, and she received a lifetime of grueling manual labor instead. With the parasites finally and permanently removed from my life, the heavy, suffocating fog of grief that had surrounded my father's sudden death slowly began to lift. In its place, a bright, clear path forward revealed itself. I officially stepped down from my position at the corporate accounting firm, packing up my office with a renewed sense of purpose. I took the helm of my father's commercial real estate company, transitioning from a forensic accountant into a chief executive officer. Walking into his massive corner office on my very first day felt like stepping into a pair of shoes that were always meant to fit me perfectly. The familiar scent of his leather chair and the view of the bustling city below filled me with a deep, comforting warmth. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I did not just passively manage his extensive property portfolio. I utilized my decade of rigorous experience as a forensic accountant to completely audit the family business from the ground up. I combed through the property lists, identifying long-standing operational inefficiencies, renegotiating bloated vendor contracts, and restructuring the corporate tax strategies to maximize our revenue streams. I applied the same cold, analytical precision that had dismantled my husband's criminal empire to optimizing my father's legacy. Within the first 6 months of my leadership, I had increased the company's overall profit margins by 20%, transforming an already successful business into a highly optimized modern real estate empire. Every time I closed a new commercial acquisition or signed a major tenant lease, I felt my father's presence guiding my hand, proud of the woman I had become. During those quiet evenings in my executive office, I often reflected on the incredible journey of the past year. My father had not just left me a vast accumulation of wealth and property. He had left me a final brilliant test of strength. He had intentionally built the financial stability clause into his irrevocable trust, not just to protect his money, but to protect me from the very people he knew would try to exploit my gentle nature. He gave me the ultimate tool to expose the true, predatory nature of the people surrounding me, forcing me to step out of the shadows of my grief and wield my own inherent power. He taught me even in death that trust must be earned and that boundaries must be enforced with absolute unyielding resolve. The culmination of this entire journey arrived on a warm, beautiful evening in late summer. I stood on the expansive wooden balcony of my father's fully restored lake house. I had hired a team of expert craftsmen to repair the damage Melanie had caused, meticulously restoring the antique leather chair and refinishing the scuffed hardwood floors until they gleamed like glass. The house was no longer a silent, empty monument to the past. Tonight it was filled with warmth, laughter, and the sounds of genuine connection. I was hosting an elegant catered dinner party for my true friends, my loyal colleagues, and the dedicated mentors who had stood by me when my world was falling apart. Mr. Gallagher was sitting in the living room sharing a glass of fine bourbon with my former business partner, Jordan. They were laughing warmly at a story being told by the corporate counsel from Gavin's old firm, a woman who had become a close, trusted friend after our collaborative takedown of the embezzlement scheme. The atmosphere was light, authentic, and completely devoid of the toxic, manipulative tension that had defined every family gathering I had ever attended with my former in-laws. These were people who valued my intelligence, respected my boundaries, and celebrated my success without a single ounce of envy or entitlement. I stepped away from the lively conversation and walked to the edge of the balcony, resting my hands against the cool wooden railing. I looked out over the calm, dark water of the lake, watching the silver moonlight dance across the gentle ripples. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint, sweet scent of pine trees and fresh water. I took a deep, grounding breath, filling my lungs with the pure, untainted atmosphere of my own hard-won freedom. I had faced the darkest, most terrifying betrayal of my life, and I had emerged entirely victorious. I had successfully defended my father's honor, reclaimed my absolute independence, and secured a legacy that would last for generations. I smiled, a quiet, profound expression of deep contentment. I had finally learned the most valuable lesson of all. My greatest asset was never the $5 million real estate portfolio, the offshore accounts, or the luxury properties. My greatest asset, the one weapon no one could ever steal, manipulate, or forge, was my own brilliant, unbreakable mind. I stayed at the railing for another quiet moment. Not because I needed to replay what Gavin, Barbara, and Melanie had done, but because I finally did not need to. Their consequences belonged to them. My future belonged to me. Behind, my friends laughed inside the restored house, and for the first time since my father's death, the sound did not feel like something happening in a life I had lost. It felt like my own life beginning again. My father had protected the trust with legal clauses, but the deeper protection was the lesson underneath them. Love without boundaries becomes permission for exploitation. Money can be replaced. Property can be repaired. Reputation can be rebuilt. The harder thing to recover is the instinct to trust yourself after someone has spent years teaching you to doubt what you see. I had recovered that instinct, and I knew I would never surrender it again. I turned from the lake and walked back toward the light spilling through the open doors. I was not carrying anger with me. I was carrying clarity. My greatest asset had never been the $5 million portfolio. It was the mind that could follow the truth when everyone around me tried to bury it. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments about a moment when you finally set a boundary that changed your life. And if you want more stories about resilience, financial independence, and reclaiming your power, like the video and subscribe. Thank you for listening.